Hi, and welcome to Live, Laugh, Shut the Fuck Up, and Listen. I am your host, Katie Leeds, Chief Owl at Outstanding Women Leaders podcast, and your strategic partner for all things leadership and life.
And I'm your co-host, Marissa Senzaki. I'm a holistic career coach and startup consultant, bringing the humanity back to human resources.
In today's episode, boundaries, burnout, and bad advice. We're exploring boundaries. What are they? How do we use them effectively? And are people weaponizing the term? Marissa, tell me all of your thoughts on boundaries.
So boundaries has been coming up a lot for me in the last week, whether speaking to clients in coaching calls or just going through different forums that I'm in. And it's interesting to me because I think people are taking the term and using it pretty loosely and in ways that maybe aren't really boundaries, but just to communicate what their opinions are, almost to pick fights with other people I'm seeing. So I thought it'd be a good time to say, like, what is a boundary? And we all might have a little bit different opinions on it. And how do we go about setting them? And from a place that's out of love and not anger.
It's interesting you say that sometimes it feels like they're picking a battle because the title I had sourced for this, I thought would be Are Boundaries Just Battles? Because I think that what happens is boundaries become a battle for yourself. And now all of a sudden you're breaking your own boundary. And so that's a lot of battling. That's a lot of breaking. And they end up doing the opposite. Boundaries are supposed to let things in and not, I think we traditionally think of boundaries as keeping things out. And if we consider that what's in the boundary is your body, it's you, like this is me in the boundary here. And if I have, if I created a desk space, it would be my boundary, then like I would be very careful about what I put on my desk because there's only so much space. This does not translate. I have ADHD. My desk is a mess. But if you think about the things, but there's a reason why, right? My boundary would on my desk, I have all these note cards because if it's out of sight, it's out of mind for me. So if you think about, well, how do I let more in? That's the purpose of boundaries. And also, how do I leave room for things to leave that aren't for me?
When you say that, I'm almost picturing, because I think, and I've seen some quotes somewhere where it's like, people think of this boundary as this electrical fence that you can't cross. And if you do, something bad is going to happen to you. But I'm seeing it now as more like this revolving door. So you're letting the good, you're letting the things that align with you in. But at the same time, if things are no longer feeling right to you, they're free to leave.
Yeah. I had a client once that was describing her boundary as a gate that was open. And there was a wall that was in the middle of a field that was starting to crumble. And that wall was sort of significant for her of these boundaries that had built up, like really like the inner battle. That's what we're having. And she was seeing it starting to crumble. And for her, when it was just an empty field with an open gate, that would be her picture of boundaries. And I'd never in my life heard that described by anyone. I thought it was so beautiful. It was like 3 years ago. And it really shaped the way that I even saw boundaries for myself. My church at the time was talking about guardrails, right? Guardrails, you got to have guardrails so that you can feel it when you hit it. And it really helped me kind of see when it's open like that, it's actually okay if someone violates my boundary, because they're not violating me. I can leave the empty field. They can also leave the empty field. Like the gate is open. And that really made me feel like I was bringing my power back to envision standing in a field where you can't violate anything. It's open here. Doesn't mean I'm available for everything. It doesn't mean I say yes to everything. But that I don't have to feel triggered. And that's what was happening when I was trying to create boundaries. I was just looking for people to, like, when you create something, then you're going to find it, right? The universe is like, oh, you don't want this thing. Let's make sure you don't really want it. Like, we're just going to keep throwing it. it's like we're not even focusing on the thing we want. We're focusing on the thing we don't want. We have to make sure it doesn't show up. And if it does, we're going to battle with it.
And it sounds like a lot of that too is an inner battle. It's maybe not as much about the boundaries we think we're setting with other people, but it's knowing ourselves better. And kind of what you're saying, if you're, I guess, exposing yourself to, or you're letting things happen that are upsetting to you and triggering you, and you keep waiting, what I see is a lot of people who then set a boundary out of anger. And then it becomes this last minute fight, all or nothing. You know, if you don't do as I say, it means you don't love me.
You know, the boundary of anger, I think, is why we see a lot of burnout. People get pissed and then they want to set these boundaries and then they keep getting crossed. And we get even tighter with those. And that is a lot of headspace. That is a lot of negative energy. And that over time becomes boundaries also start to become us trying to control. And when we control, there's no ease and flow. I can't be in an open field. That control makes us feel safe, but in reality, we're actually less safe because that control can be given away to someone else at any moment that they cross our boundary.
So I can't help myself. I won't name names, but I think a lot of people know who we're talking about. If I were to say to a partner, you can't post bikini photos online, that's a control. I don't see that as
I don't know why we're not naming this person if we're naming other people. This is the hill that you're willing to not die on, Marissa. Pun intended. I get it. We're not giving anyone exposure today. You know, in that exchange, what you see is that no one actually has any boundaries. Everybody just has some triggers. And if I am that person with the open field or your revolving door, then that person would just revolve out that door. And the reason that the reason that some of us end up like her, myself included, where it's like, okay, you know, I can do that. I would never have done the picture and that whole thing. But also I really like Gen X men that never really got on social. They tend to be my favorite. They're very loyal. How could they not be? Who the hell are they going to meet in the real world? No one talks anymore. They can take out a Craigslist ad. No, I digress. But it's because we want something, like there's a fear. And so if you're really looking at what boundaries are, anger, but boundaries are also created out of fear. And, you know, that big empty field is love. Love is letting go. Love is not being attached. Love is being okay with saying those boundaries sound really important to you. They're not important to me.
And some of that fear comes from a feeling of unsafety. You kind of touched on that, feeling safe. But I would challenge people to look at, like, how can they start to put that feeling of safety in their own hands and not look externally to, if you do X, I will feel safe. I can understand to a degree where you communicate what that looks like for you, but ultimately, we're all adults now. It's in our hands to do things that make ourselves feel safe and bring that feeling to ourselves.
Yeah, you know, what comes up when you say that for me is when I tried to enforce a boundary that my therapist and I had talked about, and also just yelling in general. I felt very triggered. Now I understand like why I don't like why it was hard for me to be with anger from a human design perspective of just, oh, I'm feeling this. If they're mad at a 5, I'm feeling it like a 15 and I'm dying inside because, you know, it hurts. Understanding that allowed my own personal physical boundary to have that. But when Dan and I first moved in together, I broke a glass that slipped out of my hand. And he like yelled, and that just took me right back to being a kid. And I was like, I'm not going to be, and I was so upset thinking, I can't live with someone that would yell at me. I can't believe I moved in with this man. Like, this is right. For me though, fast forward, like, you know, what I thought I needed when I came back in, he gave me a hug when I came back in, it was fine. What I thought I needed was like, you can't ever yell at me like that again. And that's fair. Like you don't need to yell at me like that again, but also in the future, because I'm now working on my nervous system, not a fake boundary with words I have, but a breathing boundary of nervous system is I recognize his anger is fear. He was afraid I was going to cut myself. If you ever seen Dan around fire or glass, he thinks like some, because I've cut myself before. He also feels it. It was a fear. This man loves me so much. He was afraid, but his fear came out as an anger. And for me, I don't need to absorb that anger and also recognize that it is a fear. So fast forward, I'm doing my taxes and he gets a little snippy with me. And no, he doesn't need to talk to me like that. But he didn't curse me out or anything. But he was, again, he wanted to help me. He had a fear. And so when we recognize that we can either choose, we can choose to calm ourselves, as you had said. There's also you can do some of that growth in a relationship too. I feel like we're so like, no, you can't, like we can support each other. But Dan's support was with a hug. It wasn't like, let's talk about boundaries and what you need, and it was me regulating my own emotional system. And really recognizing that these moments are just moments to inspire us. Like it's moments now I would get really curious, like, ooh, Katie, like what's going on here? Why are you 5 years old and wanting to cry over this, like, this glass? I think these are, whenever we feel like a boundary is violated, it's really an opportunity for us to get curious about ourselves and like, just notice what's happening for ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I've approached this in a similar way. Like in the last week, I felt myself and my body getting a little triggered because I wasn't getting the kinds of responses I wanted from some text messages I was sending. And so unregulated me would probably then send something angry. But instead of doing that, I thought about, okay, well, what am I feeling with being triggered? What are the needs that I have? And I thought I need clarification, and honestly, I need some attention. So how do I first give myself attention and give myself clarification about how I feel? Because a lot of times I'm not looking inward to think about my emotions. So I did that first through like journaling, some meditation, really trying to bring myself back out of my head and into my body. And when I gave myself that love and attention first, it didn't really matter so much that I wasn't getting answers to my text messages. That was sure upsetting, but it was no longer something that made me feel upset and unsafe in my body.
Mm. Oh. So what I hear then for you is that your boundaries involve journaling and meditating before you message someone. And and I like to talk about your inner authority, like is your ultimate boundary. So you just ask yourself, and what do I need here? And back to that scenario with Dan and breaking a glass, like to a regulated Katie just looks at him like, hey, it's broken glass. It's not necessary. Right. Versus the very triggered Katie that also wanted to cry and we may have had some drinks. But looking at the like the self-regulation you talk about, I also think that it's also an opportunity for us to recognize that we teach people how we want to be treated. And so, for me to for me to respond the way he's responding, like he's teaching me how to respond, right? For us to take a look at if this doesn't bring you joy or light you up, generators, then it's a sign of, if you're feeling frustrated, then it's a sign that you're on the wrong track. It's a sign that there's a not self. So I think for me, it was just returning to me. I am a calm in the storm. I don't normally, this is also the guilt I probably felt about then not feeling safe or feeling comfortable. Or it really goes back to, who are you really? I think you said that earlier, knowing yourself better. And knowing myself better, like I'm not going to cry over being yelled at for something I shouldn't be yelled at again.
Right. But I think what's great is you realized in that moment that it wasn't about Dan necessarily yelling about a broken glass. It was the memories maybe that were brought up for you and how you experienced that when you were younger. So part of that is not only knowing yourself, but then communicating that to the person that you might need to set a boundary with, and not in a way that's just, don't you raise your voice at me. But if you raise your voice, it reminds me of, maybe this painful time in my childhood that then makes me feel unsafe. I would say, you work on that safety on your own, but you also communicate the kind of the story behind it and why that happens for you. And it's up to the other person whether or not they can empathize with that.
Yeah, the empathy is an interesting one too that you talk about, because I think that is the other. So in my case, I took a walk around the block, and so when I got back, I didn't have to articulate anything, because I just simply had a hug and I'm a sorry. And for me, like, it's interesting to think of, well, what if he hadn't reacted that way? um, then I suppose you could use that fancy, that's a violation of a boundary, or that's a gaslighting situation, or that is like whatever it would be. I think the partner's role in that is just to show empathy and apologize. He didn't need to know that, it happened to me before a lot. My grandma created a song called Nobody Cries Over Spilt Milk, because I would cry if I spilt something because I got in trouble at home. Like, I had emotional parents. I'm a little sacral Katie. And so he didn't need that. There didn't need to have to be words. I think sometimes we're so, like, a boundary is just walking into that room and seeing if the other person doesn't treat you exactly how how they should in that moment, which is just to show empathy, then perhaps that's not, that wouldn't have been for me. So in my scenario, like, I didn't have to go down a rabbit hole of boundaries or setting that, because really what I needed to do in that moment was to feel seen and heard. Like, I was just sad. I was upset. And then of course I said, you can't speak to me like that again. He's like, I'll never yell at you again. But the empathy part of that, there is, you don't need boundaries with your partner. If the boundary is that if he loves me, why would he want me to cry? And that's what he said. He's like, I love you. I'm upset when you cry. I'm upset. So those showing someone how you want them to treat you, and then believing them when they treat you that way. We don't need a bunch of boundaries then. We just would never, why would you stay in an open field when someone is not hugging you when you're crying?
It sounds like you've learned what you need in those moments, and when you need to take some space also to process.
But now in those moments, I don't need that space.
Yeah.
Right. And like, I think that's part of the healing process, is like, in that particular moment when it happened, it doesn't matter what your partner's upset about. You just hold that space for them. And that was just all it needed to be. So, bringing that to corporate, I know a lot of times people feel corporate. I love that corporate's just fully blurred the lines now. There's no line between personal and professional development, because this bleeds right over. Part of the yelling was that, I was in a corporate setting where I was being yelled at. And so I was just particularly sensitive to being yelled at in that moment. How do you see burnout and boundaries and their connection in corporate?
Yeah, I think it goes back to stuff we've talked about before about this bring your full self to work, open office, work-life balance. There kind of isn't much of a delineation sometimes anymore. Maybe we're working from home and working remotely, or we always have Slack going off on our phone. We always feel the need to respond to an email. But I would say in that sense, it does go back to knowing yourself and what your needs are, like what you're willing to do, how you want to spend your work time and your time away from the office, or from however you distinguish that. So it's less about like my boss sent me an email at 7 p.m. at night and now I'm triggered and I'm upset, but it's really getting back to like, well, how do I want to work? And how can I set those boundaries for myself? Maybe I silence my notifications on certain apps after 6 o'clock, and I let them know, if you message me after 6, I'll get back to you the next business day.
Yeah. I don't talk as much about boundaries in corporate as I do alignment. And so my reframe, when I talk about boundaries as an individual, I talk about your body. Like, your body has the answer. And if you listen to your body, then you're not going to have to worry about setting these really important boundaries for yourself. So alignment for me looks like, well, how you lead back to your partner, and how you treat people, how to treat you. So you do set that alignment of, and you can encourage others to also be in alignment around taking care of themselves. I find burnout so interesting because it's like, who owns this? Is it the company? Is it the employee? Is it 50-50 responsibility? And I think of the classroom, right? Who owns whether or not the students learn? Is it the teacher? Is it the student? Is it 50-50? Is it all just the teacher? And I think burnout, you talked on a previous podcast I've done with you on psychological safety and how to interview for a place. And that feels like it's in alignment with you. The hard part with interviews is you can get in there and you may never know. But you set up from day one how you want to be treated. And so you get alignment day one on your dream schedule, and you're going to have to compromise. This is life. But if you show up a yes man, and I've been hearing this a lot lately, and hey, we are talking about boundaries, burnout, and bad advice. So whether you think this is bad advice or good advice is totally up to you. But the yes man, I'm saying yes to everything in 2023. When you take a new job, we typically say yes to everything because we want to show off. We want to get this next promotion, right? And so we say yes because we think we have to. Society said, so-and-so said, my mentor said. Back to, do you know yourself well enough? If you know yourself, then you go in knowing what your dream schedule is. You go in knowing, when are you most productive? Don't schedule meetings during those times. You go in knowing, when are you least productive? Like a 3 p.m. podcast for me is great. I'm taking a nap on the couch right now if I'm not doing a podcast. But for me to try to write, no, not going to work for me. I think going back to knowing yourself, it's not boundaries that you're setting. You're just setting yourself up for success. Like, this is how you flow naturally.
Yeah, so it's exactly like knowing what your work style is, what you need to feel energized, what you need to feel happy in the type of work you do.
Yeah, and knowing what you're willing to be okay with not having, and being intentional about that. So I always talk about, we'll use the boundary again, is Mondays and Fridays after 12 p.m. I don't see clients. Except last week I saw 3 clients after that. And there was an intention behind it. Well, one, I had a floating calendar on there. I didn't know it was there, and someone snagged it. And this was a very special client. I didn't have the heart to rearrange. And then I asked another client to come. So but when I'm making resonant choice, which is what balance is just resonant choice. Do I want to make that choice? Not, do I think I have to? Am I being forced to? But really, do I want to? And in that case, then, there's no reason for you to have any other boundary versus, do I want to do this? And on being intentional. I don't know that we're really intentional. And then when we're not intentional, we end up with this burnout.
I like that, being intentional. So I'll share a quote. Normally we talk about different thought leaders. Terry Cole is someone that I follow on Instagram. She's a licensed psychotherapist. She's an author of a book called Boundary Boss. What I do like about her, she is a psychotherapist. So, sometimes I'm like, don't necessarily take advice or psychological advice from someone who doesn't have a background in that. But we were kind of maybe not necessarily 100% agreeing on this. She has a quote that says, the burnout epidemic might actually be a bad boundary epidemic. But maybe after this conversation, it's not about boundaries. It's about not having intention or knowing oneself.
Yeah. And so we like to play a blame game. And this is the American way. We got to find the root of the problem, and then we'll never have the problem. Sometimes the reward is the activity itself, guys. Like, sometimes, like, these are just things that happen, but there's not a blame game in the burnout. It's knowing yourself. If you know yourself so well, you watch women that know themselves. They're not going on a second date with someone that isn't aligned for them. You watch women that know themselves in corporate, they're pushing back on projects. They're okay with saying no. Women that know themselves really well are okay with walking away from the BlackRock salary to hop into something new or to start their own business because they'll bet on themselves. When we know ourselves and where we're and what matters to us, and the problem is that we think we know ourselves really well. And how many of us are pleasers? If you're a pleaser, recovering pleaser here, then you don't. And you don't need to go to the root of why that is and you do all that. What you can start to do is start tuning into your body and asking it, what are we feeling? What are we noticing? What is coming up for us? And so you talked about earlier, the journaling and the meditating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I guess my last thought would be, I had a client that I coached this week and I said, what do you want to talk about this week? And she's like, boundaries. I'm bad with boundaries. And it turned out, I don't know, it wasn't really a boundary. It was she and her partner had different ideas of how they wanted to spend their date night. And I asked her, I'm like, well, so did you tell him what you wanted to do? And he just shot it down. She's like, well, no, I didn't say anything. And so I was like, okay, well, why, like, let's get into like why you didn't say anything and what would you have wanted to do? Like, and why do you want to do that? And it took a while for her, I think, to even understand what her own needs and wants were and what really like would light her up. And so I think that's the important part, is maybe the boundary is not examining the relationships you're setting with everyone else, but the relationship you have with yourself.
Yeah, the leader within. Self-acceptance and self-authority. And it's really hard to come from a place of self-authority. I know, because I've lived a life where I wasn't coming from a place of self-authority all the time, when you don't fully know who you are. And part of why I think we don't always know who we are is there's parts of us that we don't want to accept or that we're trying to change. I see a lot of the be a better version of you, when really we just need to integrate. We're integrating the light and the dark. There is no need to get rid of or to have more of this and less of that. There's just a full integration. And when you fully accept all of you, which is again what I love about human design, and you understand your mechanics, things will start to synchronize. And then you don't really have to, the boundaries are, speak for themselves, because you just know what to say yes and no to. It's like walking through a department store and you're just like, no to that, yes to this, and that looks good. There's less, we think that our head has the answers. I would argue that burnout epidemic is because we use logic to make all of these decisions. And then we got there and we're like, why are we happy? Why are we so burned out? Like, but if you look back at the choices that your brain was making, right, from its very logical place, it never consulted the body. It never asked the body what we should do. And sometimes the brain overrides the body and we know it. And then we're like, I knew I didn't have energy for that, but I did it anyways. And here's what happened. And somehow that's a boundary. If you're going to have any boundary, go to your body. All about the bees today.
So would you say boundaries are also about just integrating your full self into your decision process?
Ooh, that's an interesting way to put it. I think that boundaries are your body being the decision process maker.
Interesting. I like that.
So as we wrap up today, Marissa, one of your favorite ways to help support people around boundaries, avoiding burnout and getting bad advice is tell us a little bit about how we can take that assessment and learn a little bit more about how you support people there.
Yeah, so I do a couple different frameworks or teachings in the coaching that I do, but I am certified in integrated attachment theory. And part of that is looking at your needs and how you communicate that. But, that's kind of, to me, the first step is figuring out like, what are your needs and how do those communicate into your values and how you live your life. And a lot of times we think we know what we want, but when we look at like what we think about, how we spend our time, where we put our emotional energy, it's actually somewhere else. And so I help people go through a whole assessment to really prioritize what it is they want out of life right now.
Marissa's a great, I love that where you kind of meet people where they're at and helping them to integrate as well for their nervous system. And for me, human design is a way that I help people integrate the shadow and the gift that they have, because every gift comes with a shadow. I can't know everything without having a few opinions here and there. And the mechanics of that just means I need to be invited to share those opinions. So for people that feel like I do know myself and I still am, I don't have good boundaries, I could be sharper with these. I think human design is another great place for you to take a look at. of understanding your water a little bit more. And for many of us, we do know our water. So I invite you to, shut the fuck up, listen, and stop listening to us. Start listening to your body, and consult it before you make decisions. Intuition does not make sense. I have found that my intuition is never wrong, but it only speaks once. So have fun listening to your body and your intuition and what it's calling you to do. And there is also a link if you want to grab a strategic call with Marissa and I. 30 minutes on our calendar. We have 3 a month that we give away for free. And I don't remember the dates of them again, Marissa. We have to get that in our script for next.
Yes, well, it's going to be August soon, so we'll have to pick some new dates in the calendar. But yeah, we have that there available if you're interested.
Yes. Thank you for joining us. Join us next Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. We love it when you join us to love, laugh, and shut the fuck up and listen.